Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition and Dungeon Masters and Game Masters, and whether Dungeon Masters and Game Masters, I'm going to say Dungeon Masters in this because I think that's what's important, but I do think what we're talking about, a lot of that would go directly over to Game Masters, okay? All right, so let's talk about, and the fact that there are people now saying that Dungeon Masters, and also by extension, Game Masters, are not storytellers. And how this is outrageously, patently wrong. Okay, all right. So, first of all, let's talk about why we're talking about this. We're talking about this because of Professor Dungeon Master. There's a great channel. It's called Dungeon Craft, and it has a dude just like me who talks about tabletop role-playing games, and very rarely has any guests on. He just kind of talks by himself about, he commentates on Dungeons & Dragons. He commentates on tabletop role-playing games, and I consider him a D&D commentator, Professor Dungeon Master. And he recently did a fantastic video, which has outrageously wrong information in it, about saying that Dungeon Masters are not storytellers, right? Now, so here you have this person side. There's a lot here. Here you have this person on the internet, and they're saying something that's patently wrong. And in my opinion, it's patently wrong, okay? And I think I don't even think this is my opinion. I do think this is fact. It's so blatantly obvious, in my opinion, that this is fact. Well, I guess this would... what I'm saying is definitely in my opinion. I also think it's fact. It's my opinion that it's fact. But I guess that's the other thing, is facts really aren't debatable, right? Like, if you drop a bowling ball from the top of my house, it's a fact it's going to hit the ground. If there's nothing in between and nothing is intervened, right? Like, that's a fact, right? It's not debatable. But, okay, let's keep this moving. All right, here's the thing. Professor Dungeon Master said Game Masters aren't storytellers, okay? Now, I'm going to use the term Dungeon Master because I really don't care about Game Masters. But, many Game Masters are Dungeon Masters or will be Dungeon Masters. I think there is an incredibly small amount of Game Masters who have not been a Dungeon Master or will not be a Dungeon Master. So I'm going to use the term Dungeon Master. I think most of what I'm saying flows over to Game Master as well. So I think this is outrageously wrong, and I think that Dungeon Masters are 100% storytellers. All right, but I do want to talk about this real quick. Okay, Professor Dungeon Master is outrageously wrong, right? Just patently wrong. Doesn't mean he's stupid. In fact, I think he's brilliant. I love his channel, right? And I actually love the video. This gets complicated. How can I love something that is just shockingly wrong, right? Well, this is worth exploring because this is where we're at today, okay? When brilliant people discuss challenging topics, they will frequently get things wrong. And that's okay. It's not a point of shame. It means they rolled at something that was hard. They took on something that was difficult, and they caught their foot on the edge, and they took it in the teeth, right? And I think that's where Professor Dungeon Master is. He tried to jump over the tennis net, and now his teeth are on the ground, right? Like, this is a bad, but that doesn't mean it was stupid to try, and it doesn't mean the person was stupid for doing something wrong, right? It just means they tried something hard. That's all, right? And we need to really move past this on the internet, where if somebody says something wrong, the person on the other end of that, wrong thing says you're stupid. It's just not. I will tell you right now, I don't think I've ever met a stupid person in my life. I truly don't. And you will meet people out there who are constantly saying this person's stupid, that person's stupid. Nobody's stupid, right? Like, there really aren't. There might be one stupid person in 1,000, but 999 people are passionate, and many are brilliant. Many of them aren't brilliant, but they're passionate about something, and when they say something wrong, it's because they're passionate, and there should be no shame in being wrong, right? Now, you should be shamed once you've been presented with the evidence and you still believe the wrong thing. Should be some shame in that, but if you're talking about difficult things, it's totally okay to be wrong, and we need to take the stigma off of being wrong. And frankly, I think we should attach some stigma on not being wrong. A lot of people are never wrong because they never say anything of importance. They never say anything original. They never say anything innovative. They never say anything of any risk. And there should be stigma attached to that, in my opinion. And there isn't. And that's frustrating, right? So brilliant people can discuss incredibly challenging subjects and be wrong, and there is no shame in that. Okay, so, all right. So let me explain to you why Professor Dungeon Master is outrageously wrong when it comes to the idea that dungeon masters aren't storytellers. So what he said is, he said, hey, here's an example from my table where I was telling a story. I had this story planned, and it went in a completely different way because we rolled the dice, and I honored the dice, and I make my rolls in public. +1 on that idea. I'm 100% the same. Never fudge rolls. Only the worst hack DMs fudge rolls. Dungeon Masters fudge rolls. So I totally 100% agree with. I'm 100% agreement with Professor Dungeon Master on never fudge rolls. Right. So he makes his rolls in public. He got a shocking. He told somebody, hey, you could do this crazy thing. If you roll a 20, the person rolled a 20, and it took the story in a completely different direction than anybody at the table expected. And it was a story that Professor Dungeon Master never meant to tell. And so he's like, I'm not a dungeon master. The dice were the dungeon master, right? I'm sorry, he said, I'm not a storyteller. The dice were the storyteller. He's so wrong. All right, I'm going to explain this, all right? Now, first of all, him being wrong, again, absolutely no shame. This is incredibly complicated subject. Let's get into this, but it's fun and it's important. That's why I love Dungeons and Dragons. It's fun and it's important. All right. So here we go. All right, here it is. Storytellers. I'm going to talk about 3 types of storytellers, okay? And I think there's lots of these storytellers. They're all incredibly powerful. They have all impacted the communities they lived in, the cultures they lived in, and the direct people they came in contact with. Every single one of these storyteller types. All right, so let's talk about them. First is the oral narrator. 700 years ago, okay, you could go at different places in the world, and there were oral narrators. These were people who chose to tell stories with their human mouth to be received by human ears. And there was never a pen or a quill, or there was no written capturing of that story. The stories, sometimes they were true, sometimes they were false, sometimes they held elements of truth, right? But the stories were given from the human mouth, received by the human ear, okay? Oral narrators. There are different ones all over the world, right? And they were storytellers. What were they doing? They were doing 3 things. They were doing knowledge, at the macro level. Well, actually, you know what? Not even at the macro level. Some of these oral narrators were doing all 3 things, but all of these oral narrators were doing at least one of these 3 things, okay? The highest level ones were doing all 3 things, and there's so many parameters of this. Let me get through it, okay? So the oral narrator, right? They were doing knowledge exchange. They were doing social modeling, and they were doing self-improvement. And the self-improvement, so the knowledge exchange was taking knowledge from themselves and giving it to other people. And maybe the knowledge was transformed. Maybe it was preserved, right? But there was knowledge exchange. In addition to that, they were doing social modeling. What is social modeling? Social modeling is when they explored paths that that people in their culture, and that their culture themselves had already taken, or they were exploring paths that their culture could take in the future. Social modeling. Incredibly complex, but there were oral narrators who were doing social modeling with their storytelling, okay? And by the way, all of these oral narrators were storytellers, okay? All right. And then last, they were doing self-improvement. They were improving themselves, or, this is important, they were improving themselves, or they were improving the people who heard their stories, okay? So they were doing knowledge exchange, they were doing social modeling, and they were doing self-improvement, okay? Now, let's talk about it. Some of these oral narrators knew exactly what they were doing. They knew where they were doing all 3. They knew they were doing knowledge exchange. They knew they were doing social modeling. They knew they were doing self-improvement. Some of them didn't know this. They were doing it, but they didn't know they were doing it. They were doing, and I don't think anybody who didn't know it were doing all three. They were probably doing one or two, right? But I definitely think there were oral narrators who had no intention of improving themselves. They had other intentions. No intention of improving other people, and yet they did that, right? So these oral narrators, they were doing these three things, or they were doing some mix of those three things, and they were either aware of it or they were unaware of it, okay? All right, oral narrator, 700 years ago. 7 days ago, in America, you have Hollywood scriptwriters, okay? And what are they doing? They're doing knowledge exchange. They're doing social modeling. They're doing self-improvement. And it's exactly the same as it was 700 years ago, okay? Some of them know they're doing it. Some of them don't know they're doing it. They're doing the same thing. And that Hollywood scriptwriter is a storyteller. Now, there is a key difference between the oral narrator and the Hollywood scriptwriter. They're both storytellers, okay? It's not debatable. They are absolutely storytellers, okay? All right, so now the difference is the Hollywood scriptwriter, they're not using verbal transmission, right? They're using written transmission, the written language. They're using the written language as their medium, not human speech to human ears, right? Human mouth sounds to human ears, right? They're not using a verbal transmission. They're using a prose transmission, a written transmission, right? Pretty big deal. Last, dungeon masters. They are doing knowledge exchange, social modeling, self-improvement. Some of them are aware of it. Some of them are unaware of it. Some of them do all of it. Some of them do one of it, right? But they are absolutely, fully storytellers, okay? And they are telling stories. This is so critically important to understand, okay? And the fact that dice have been introduced does not make them any less of a storyteller, okay? Now, are there any others? So dungeon masters are storytellers. Hollywood scriptwriters are storytellers. Oral narrators are storytellers. Oh, but wait, what about this key difference, right? Of how there's dice involved. What about this random generator? Doesn't that mean that the dungeon master is not a storyteller? Did you do your research, Professor Dungeon Master? Like, guess what? Oral narrators used random generators, right? This ain't new. They didn't use dice. Some of them use dice. Some of them literally use dice, right? Some of them use different bits of ephemera to inject randomness in their storytelling, all right? Now, so dungeon masters and Hollywood scriptwriters are the same in that they both use written prose, right? They use written transmission, not verbal transmission. They use some verbal transmission, but there's also written transmission. So dungeon masters are doing both what oral narrators did, and they're doing what Hollywood scriptwriters are. Now, I would say not only are dungeon masters the greatest storytellers in history, they have surpassed the oral narrators, and they have certainly passed the Hollywood scriptwriters. Why do I think they are? Not only are they absolutely storytellers, but they're the best of all the storytellers, is mulranditure. There are for dungeon masters, there is multiple authors, there is a random generator in the mix, and there is literature in the mix. And my opinion is that Gary Gygax knew that Dungeons and Dragons would be more than a game, and it would be a vector for the highest level of storytelling that any community, any culture, any individual human had ever seen. And I think the true difference, there is no difference in them being storytellers. Dungeon masters are storytellers, and oral narrators are storytellers, and Hollywood scriptwriters are all storytellers. The difference is dungeon masters have a dashboard. They have dials that they can use to control knowledge exchange, to control social modeling, and control self-improvement that are far beyond anything any oral narrator ever had, and far beyond anything a Hollywood scriptwriter has. By the way, I also think if you're going to rank them, it's Dungeon Masters as the highest level storytellers in human history, then oral narrators, because I think they meant to help their community, Hollywood scriptwriters, right, who have absolutely no desire, in my opinion, to help their human community, right? In fact, yeah, I definitely don't think Hollywood, at the macro level, there's no feeling of obligation among Hollywood scriptwriters to help humanity. None. So I think they're at the bottom rank, right? But Dungeon Masters have this dashboard of controls to do knowledge exchange, to do social modeling, and to do self-improvement at a level no other storyteller has ever been able to do. Now, I will admit, the vast majority of Dungeon Masters don't even understand that they're sitting at the dashboard of controls. That's true. Okay, I do. You do, right? The question is if you're going to use them and if you're going to start turning the knobs. All that's my opinion and some fact, I think. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking, subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.